Clwyd.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome today's debate on the Middle East, in which many countries continue to undergo political upheavals following decades of authoritarian rule, for the benefit of those in power and at the expense of the ordinary citizen. Much attention has been directed, of course, towards Egypt, where the struggle for democracy, accountability and transparency appears to be, unfortunately, far from over. Like many others, I hope that the military will be persuaded to give way soon to a fairly elected civilian government. However, in the debate today, I want to concentrate on two other states which have been mentioned much this afternoon in the region, where the legitimacy of the government in power has been challenged. And that those governments now have to decide whether they will undertake reform of their own volition or precipitate greater instability, mistrust and suffering upon their own citizens. The countries I'm referring to are, of course, Bahrain and Syria. In Bahrain, as is generally known and has been widely reported, there were widespread protests and serious unrest between February and March of this year. On the 15th of March, after political negotiations between the government of Bahrain and the opposition had broken down, the government declared a 3-month state of national safety, which was in fact lifted on the 1st of June. Gulf Cooperation Council force units were also deployed in the country from about that time. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, there was a serious and heavy-handed government crackdown on those believed to be directing the protests, as well as on leading opposition figures. First, I believe these more recent events have to be put into context. Though there have been attempts by the government of Bahrain to reform and address human rights concerns in the recent past, particularly since the ascension to power of the current monarch, reports by well-known international human rights organisations have highlighted the use of torture by the security apparatus, impunity, unfair trials, arbitrary arrests and restrictions on freedom of expression and assembly as ongoing and serious problems, not just this year, but for many years. Amnesty International's background report on the situation in Bahrain in 2010 said, during 2010, sporadic protests took place in predominantly Shia villages against alleged government discrimination in relation to housing and employment opportunities. In some cases, protesters blocked highways with burning tyres and threw homemade petrol bombs at the police and security forces. Hundreds of people were arrested. This is not 2011, this is 2010, particularly in August and September, in connection with protests and riots, including many leading opposition figures, mostly from the Shia majority community. Many were allegedly arrested without warrants and held incommunicado for up to 2 weeks after arrest. In relation to the situation in 2009, 2 years ago, Amnesty International said, the authorities failed adequately to investigate allegations of torture and other ill treatment of detainees. Government critics were briefly detained and several websites were shut down. One person was executed. The government indicated it would decriminalise certain publishing offences, reduce legal discrimination against women and introduce other reforms. Political analysts have highlighted long-standing demands within the country for political, constitutional and socio-economic reform. In particular, calls have been made for an elected Prime Minister, an accountable government and a fully empowered and democratically elected legislature. Previous attempts by the government of Bahrain to address these demands have not been viewed as very successful by opposition leaders and resulted in a lack of trust in the government's willingness to implement genuine and meaningful political and socio-economic reform. The protests earlier this year must be seen against this backdrop of long-standing violations and grievances. The report, which both the front benches have talked about, the BICI report, was set up by the government of Bahrain, which we all welcomed, obviously to investigate and report on the allegations and the events of 2011, and to make such recommendations as they deem necessary. I, of course, welcome the King's initiative to set up this commission and to allow for the full publication of the 500 pages of the report. It presents a detailed and balanced account of events surrounding the Bahraini protest movement, the context in which it occurred, and the response by government agents. The report's findings set out in considerable detail the manifestly repressive nature of the government's crackdown on protesters and opposition leaders. The report states, and I quote, "In many situations, the security forces violated the principles of necessity and proportionality, which are the general applicable principles in matters relating to the use of force by law enforcement officials. This is evident in both the choice of weapons used by these forces during confrontations with civilians and the manner in which these weapons were used."
Will the Honourable Lady give way?
Yes.
I'm very much obliged to the Honourable Lady for giving way. What does she say to the accusation that I've heard from some people in the region that Iran was very much involved in fomenting the unrest in Bahrain?
If the Honourable Gentleman would be a little patient, I shall come to that particular point in a moment. It also states, the report, that a large number of individuals were prosecuted before the national safety courts. Numerous violations of due process rights were recorded. It appears that the Military Attorney General chose to rely on these statutory provisions that were the least favourable to the arrested persons and to defendants appearing before the national safety courts. The manner in which the security and judicial agencies of the government of Bahrain interpreted the national safety decree also opened the door for the perpetration of grave violations of human rights, including the arbitrary deprivation of life, torture, and arbitrary detention. It also details that many of the detainees were subjected to torture and other forms of physical and psychological abuse while in custody, and it lists the methods: blindfolding, handcuffing, enforced standing for prolonged periods, beating, punching, hitting the detainees with rubber hoses, including on the soles of the feet, cables, whips, metal wooden planks or other objects, electrocution, sleep deprivation, exposure to extreme temperatures, verbal abuse, threats of rape, and insulting the detainees' religious sect. And of course, those were predominantly Shia. Many of those held by the authorities claim they were forced to sign confessions or admit to committing crimes. And I think it's especially pertinent that the report notes on more than one occasion that the actions of the authorities were systematic, and I emphasise that word, systematic. That is, these violations were not the fault of a few bad apples or rogue elements. The security personnel in Bahrain were carrying out actions that were expected of them, and implicitly, if not explicitly, condoned by superiors and other branches of the government. With at least 35 deaths, thousands arrested, 4,500 employees dismissed for their support of the protests, over 500 students expelled, and 30 religious sites demolished. It is simply not credible that such a vast crackdown could have taken place at the initiative of the lower ranks of the Bahraini government alone. In this regard, the report categorically states, in many cases the security services of the government of Bahrain resorted to the use of unnecessary and excessive force, terror-inspiring behaviour and the unnecessary damage to property. The fact that a systematic pattern of behaviour existed indicates that this is how these security forces were trained and were expected to behave. And the report goes on to say that there is a culture of impunity whereby security officials have few incentives to avoid mistreatment of prisoners or take action to prevent mistreatment by other officials. Some months ago, before the summer recess, Mr Deputy Speaker, myself, on behalf of the All-Party Parliamentary Human Rights Group, and Lord Avebury, the Vice Chair, went to see the Ambassador of Bahrain at the Embassy in London. He was Mr Al Khalifa, who is one of the royal family. Eric Avebury in particular had detailed knowledge of the complaints made by some of the medical personnel. He knew personally some of the doctors. And he was very specific when we put these accusations to the then ambassador, who said he knew nothing about it and that he would come back to us with a detailed explanation of all the allegations that were made. We heard, Mr Deputy Speaker, not one word from the ambassador. And surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, in 2 weeks' time, he was gone from the embassy, never to return, and was replaced by another ambassador who again didn't give us any more information. I remain very concerned about the trials of doctors and nurses in military courts and the harsh sentences handed down. Though the King subsequently intervened, and most of these health workers are now under house arrest, awaiting trial in civil courts, given the report's findings on the brutal manner in which people were arrested and then detained, it really does beg the question whether any subsequent trials at this point can be fair, and indeed whether there is any justification for these people being held at all. Yes, certainly.
I thank my friend for giving way, and I compliment her on her meeting with the ambassador and the efforts that she and Lord Avebury have made. Would she agree with me, however, that the current process is pretty awful in Bahrain, but it is not particularly new, and it goes back to the suspension of the constitution a couple of decades ago, and the continual denial of rights of free expression ever since then, and this is merely a descent into that, and much of the surveillance that is undertaken against the opposition is done by equipment supplied by Britain?
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for making those points, which I attempted to make to the Foreign Secretary earlier. I think it is inappropriate if we are still selling arms to the Bahrainis or training Bahraini military personnel in this country, that it should not be done in the light of human rights abuses going back, as my honourable friend said, not just from the beginning of this year, but from earlier years as well. So if the government of Bahrain is to retain its legitimacy domestically and its credibility internationally, given the systematic nature of the serious human rights violations by government officials as established by the BICI, the government has to ensure that accountability for these violations goes right to the top. And if there's one criticism I would make of this report, I feel it could have gone further with a more precise allocation of responsibility for specific violations, who ordered what and when. But this is now something which the government of Bahrain itself hopefully will do. Make no mistake, Bahrain is now at a crucial crossroads where it can redeem itself in the eyes of its own citizens and the international community by making sure that first the rule of law and then wider democratic reforms prevail, by putting responsible officials, including those at the top of the chain of command, such as government ministers and senior military leaders, on trial, by engaging meaningfully with the opposition and by implementing the recommendations in the BICI report in good faith. Or it can bury its head in the sand and set the stage for further and more pronounced instability in the future. Perpetuating the myth that Iran was responsible for the unrest is not, in my view, not only unhelpful, it is also dangerous. I'm no apologist for the Iranian regime. I'm only too well aware of the terrible human rights violations perpetuated on a daily basis on its own people and the profoundly destabilising effects of its foreign policy. But I do think it's important to note the report's findings in this regard. It said, the evidence presented to the Commission does not establish a discernible link between specific incidents that occurred in Bahrain during February and March 2011 and the Islamic Republic of Iran. I think it's critical that leaders in Bahrain take responsibility for their own failings and acknowledge legitimate grievances rather than dismiss them as nothing more than foreign agitation. The Bahraini king himself has said he's determined to ensure that the report's insights will act as a catalyst for positive change and has since issued a decree to form a national commission with powers as advised in the report. But there still seems to be some reluctance on the part of the king to face up to the enormity of the task ahead. With his carefully worded statement on receipt of the report last Wednesday, which referred in his words to the unprecedented challenges faced by our authorities as they confront relentless provocation from hostile sources, both inside and outside the country, and instances of excessive force and of the mistreatment of persons placed under arrest. I trust the UK government, and I think the Foreign Secretary has already indicated that, as a friend of the Bahraini government, will encourage and persuade the latter to do what is right in the longer term, however difficult in the short term, for the people of Bahrain, the region and the wider international community. Now, I think just these words from the BICI report sums up what I want to say on Bahrain. During the beginning of the events in Bahrain, as during the past decades, the demand was for reforms, not for regime change. This was the same in the early stages of the demonstrations and protests in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria and Yemen. But as experience shows, where demand for reforms are rebuffed, the demands then ultimately call for regime change. In the end, the society becomes both polarised and radicalised. And this situation leaves little room for a centre that could bring together people from all ethnic and sectarian groups, from all social and economic strata, to work for reforms based on well-established principles and processes of democracy, good governance and respect for internationally protected human rights. And we turn briefly to Syria, Mr Deputy Speaker. Syria, as both frontbench spokesmen have said, it presents a more precarious and volatile situation, with catastrophe looming for Syria, the region and the international community, if the Ba'athist regime under the current President Bashar Assad does not renounce its long-established methods of brutality and authoritarianism. At least 3,500 people, not including members of the security forces and the army, have already been killed. The Syrian government has been violating the rights of its citizens for many years. It has long been a police state. Emergency rule was imposed in 1963 and has remained in effect ever since. The abuses now being committed are extremely serious and widespread. As Human Rights Report has recently said, torture of detainees is rampant. 25 former detainees from Homs were among those interviewed by Human Rights Watch. They all reported being subjected to various forms of torture. Human Rights Watch has independently documented 17 deaths in custody in Homs, at least 12 of which were clearly from torture. Data collected by local activists suggest even higher figures. They say that at least 40 people detained in the Homs area died in custody between April and August. Former detainees report security forces' use of heated metal rods to burn various parts of their bodies, the use of electric shocks, the use of stress positions for hours or even days at a time, and the use of improvised devices such as car tyres to force detainees into positions that make it easier to beat them on sensitive parts of the body like soles of the feet and head. Human Rights Watch has stated that the systematic nature of abuses against civilians in Homs by Syrian government forces indicate that crimes against humanity have been committed. Syrian government officials, right up to the top, will have to be held accountable for these despicable crimes. I applaud the suspension of Syria from the Arab League and Arab League members which agreed to impose sanctions on Syria this weekend in their attempt to ramp up the pressure on the Syrian government to comply with an Arab League peace plan which it had supposedly accepted. The Arab League's initiatives obviously come in the wake of sanctions imposed by the US and the EU. It is time now, however, for the international community, and particularly the UN Security Council, to do more to bring the Syrian government to its senses, to get it to end the violent crackdown immediately and to allow for the immediate deployment of monitors on the ground. Of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are no easy solutions. I do not underestimate the challenge of getting the current Syrian government to stop its brutal campaign of repression and of avoiding civil war. Military intervention on the part of outsiders may also be counterproductive. I fear it may now be a case of too little and too late, with the international community having done almost nothing over the years to encourage the Syrian government to change its ways. But we cannot abdicate our responsibility now. We cannot continue to leave the many brave Syrians at the mercy of a government which has never had any regard for them.